Okay, so dating today, it's a wild world out there, right? Like trying to read signals, figure out the rules, it can be a bit of a minefield. And then you've got books like The Rational Male by Rollo Tomassi that are, well, let's just say they stir things up. It's a book and really a whole community called the manosphere that people have some strong opinions about. So, buckle up, because in this deep dive, we're going headfirst into the rational male to really dissect the main arguments, see what's controversial, and see if we can pull out any insights from it all. Whether you're already familiar with this stuff or this is totally new territory for you, get ready, because it's going to get us thinking.
Yeah, one of the things that really strikes me about Tomassi's approach is how he tackles dating and relationships, almost like, an anthropologist studying some newly discovered culture.
hmm
He's got this idea that men and women, they're operating in what he calls a sexual marketplace. You'll hear that phrase a lot in his book.
A sexual marketplace. That's kind of a cold way to put it, don't you think?
Yeah, it does sound a little clinical, right? And that's actually a big part of why Tomassi's work rubs some people the wrong way.
Mhm.
He's basically saying that if men want to, I guess, succeed in this marketplace, they need to wise up to these, like, unspoken rules, the dynamics that are going on beneath the surface.
So less about romance, more about strategy almost.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like he's got this playbook,
Mm.
and one of the biggest rules in there is this thing called hypergamy.
Hmm.
Now, that term gets thrown around a lot in these spheres, but basically what Tomassi's getting at is this, like, deep-seated drive he thinks women have to go for partners who are, well, higher status.
When you say higher status, what does it actually mean in this context?
He's talking about a whole bunch of things: career success, how much money a guy makes, social standing, even how attractive he is physically. Tomassi would say even those things that seem kind of superficial, like wanting a partner with a good job, they all tie back to this deeper, maybe even biological drive.
So he's bringing biology into it.
He is, yeah. He'd argue that hypergamy, it has roots in our evolution, that back in the day, it made sense for women to choose mates who could provide for them and protect them. Now, we got to be careful here, because saying it's all down to biology is way too simplistic, right? Like, our social and cultural influences are huge. But if you're looking at it through Tomassi's lens, hypergamy is like this driving force behind how women behave, especially when it comes to choosing a partner.
Okay, so let's say for a second that this whole hypergamy thing is the name of the game. How are men even supposed to handle this so-called sexual marketplace? Tomasi has these guidelines. He calls them iron rules. Some of them are pretty straightforward, but then there are others, well, they definitely make you stop and think, like this one. Never allow a woman to be in control of the birth. That's a pretty loaded statement.
Yeah, that one definitely gets people fired up. And I think to understand where he's coming from with that, you got to remember Tomassi's whole perspective puts a lot of emphasis on traditional gender roles.
Yeah.
And he's got a very particular view of how power works in relationships. With that rule, he's really talking about who makes the decisions about, like, contraception, family planning, that kind of thing. He's suggesting that if a man isn't the one making the decisions there, he's putting himself in a vulnerable spot.
It's almost like he's saying men are kind of powerless against this combination of female biology and what society expects. Now, whether or not you agree with that is a whole other deep dive, but it's definitely something we got to understand if we want to break down the rest of his arguments.
No question about it. And this is where it gets really interesting, because Tomassi takes these iron rules, this whole hypergamy idea, and he uses them to deconstruct what he sees as, like, these harmful myths about relationships, myths that he thinks are holding men back from actually finding success in the dating world.
Myths, we got iron rules, this whole sexual marketplace thing. It's a lot to wrap your head around. So let's, like, I don't know, try to break down some of these so-called myths that Tomasi's going after.
Okay, so one of the big ones, and I bet a lot of people listening have heard this one, it's the myth of the biological clock. The idea that women have this limited time to have kids.
Right, right.
Now, Tomassi's not denying biology here, but he'd say this pressure on women to have children by a certain age, it can turn into this, like, tool that pushes men into settling down before they're ready.
So a guy might feel like he's got to commit because of this ticking clock, not because he's actually ready for that step.
That's exactly it. And remember how we were talking about hypergamy? Well, Tomassi connects this myth to that too.
Yeah.
It plays into those instincts, makes men feel like they got to lock down a high-value woman before her biological clock runs out. He'd say men shouldn't let some deadline be the reason they make a decision as big as that.
Don't let a ticking clock hijack your love life, basically. And speaking of societal pressures, he's also got something to say about this whole the myth of male looks. It's like he's challenging this idea that men have to look like, male models to find a partner.
Yeah, yeah, he'd say that while looks matter at first, when it comes down to it, women are looking at other things. A man's confidence, can you provide for a family, things like that. He even goes back to evolution again here, saying that throughout history, a man's resources, his status, that's what really mattered for a long-term relationship, more than if he had a six-pack.
So ditch the gym membership, focus on building your empire. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I wouldn't go that far. But Tomassi's point is that guys shouldn't get so hung up on how they look. He even argues that this whole emphasis on male looks, it's kind of a new thing driven by, the media, advertising, all that.
Interesting. And he doesn't stop there. He's also got the myth of the good girl, where he's basically questioning this whole image of, like, feminine innocence and purity, which feels, I don't know, kind of dicey.
Yeah, he's definitely wading into tricky territory with that one. What he argues is that this good girl ideal, it's often used to, like, manipulate men to play on this desire they have for a partner who's, virtuous and all that. He'd say that all women, no matter how they act or seem, they're all driven by the same basic instincts, including those hypergamous ones we talked about.
Okay, so we've got hypergamy, these iron rules. Now he's deconstructing myths left and right. It's like Tomassi's giving men this whole, like, framework for how to understand this, as he calls it, sexual marketplace. And a big part of that, if I'm following correctly, is this idea of frame control.
Right. Frame control is huge for Tomassi. Think of it this way. Have you ever noticed how the person who seems more in control in a situation, like a social situation, they kind of influence how everyone else acts?
Yeah, they set the tone.
Yeah, exactly. Like, what are the rules, even if they're not saying them out loud? It's kind of what Tomassi means by frame.
So it's about, like, setting the terms of engagement, being the one who's kind of directing the flow of things.
Exactly. And Tomassi, he's all about men consciously trying to have this frame control when they're interacting with women. He thinks if men can do that, they can avoid being manipulated or taken advantage of or, like, losing power in the relationship. He even gives you specific ways to, like, establish and keep that dominant frame.
It's interesting, though, because this whole frame control thing, it can seem a little manipulative itself, can't it?
Oh, absolutely. And that's where you get a lot of the criticism of Tomassi's work. Critics would say that this kind of strategic approach to relationships, where it's all about control and tactics, it can be really damaging.
And it's not just the frame control part, right? Like,
Yeah.
people criticize Tomassi and this whole manosphere world for being misogynistic or having a really cynical view of relationships overall.
For sure. There's this big debate about whether what Tomassi's doing is actually helpful for men or if it's harmful for them and for how we think about dating and relationships in general. Some people say he's just giving men the tools they need to navigate this really complex dating world we have now, while others think he's making these harmful stereotypes about men and women even worse and turning relationships into this battleground where someone wins and someone loses.
It's a lot to unpack, that's for sure. So where do we even go from here?
Well, even if we don't agree with every single thing in The Rational Male, I think there's still some really good takeaways, some useful stuff in there that we can all think about, even if we don't buy into his whole philosophy.
Okay, I'm listening. What can we learn from all this, even if we're not going full-on rational male in our own lives? So much to think about with the rational male, right? Like, we've got this whole hypergamy thing, the iron rules, deconstructing myths, frame control. It's a lot. But even if we're not, like, signing up for everything Tomassi says, what can we actually take away from all this? What's the takeaway, even if we don't buy into his whole philosophy?
Right, right. Because there's got to be something, right? I think one thing that's really valuable, even if you don't agree with how Tomassi gets there, is this idea of, like, self-awareness in relationships. He might call it strategy or game. But when you really get down to it, knowing what you want, what your needs are, where your boundaries are, that's huge in any relationship, not just romantic ones.
Yeah, totally. It's so easy to just get caught up in, I don't know, what you should be doing, what everyone else expects, or even just the excitement of a new relationship, but taking a step back and being like, okay, what do I want here? That's so important.
Yeah, and I think it ties into another thing Tomassi talks about a lot, which is power dynamics. Now, the way he talks about it, it can be a bit much, but he's got a point that relationships aren't always equal. And seeing how those power dynamics, even the subtle ones, can influence things, that can be a real eye-opener.
It's like knowledge is power, right? Even if you're not trying to control the frame, just knowing how it's being set, whether it's you or the other person, can help you figure out how to deal with it.
Exactly, exactly.
Yep.
Now, that doesn't mean we should all be suspicious of each other or constantly trying to be in control, but just recognizing that power dynamics exist and they can totally affect how we interact, I think that can lead to healthier relationships, more balanced ones.
So being mindful, not manipulative, that's the key.
Exactly. And that's where, I don't know, being discerning comes in. Like Tomasi talks a lot about men being able to spot women who might be trying to manipulate them. And even though the way he puts it can be harsh, I do think there's something to be said for being choosy about who you let into your life, what
Mhm.
kind of behavior you're okay with.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And that goes for anyone, not just men. Like knowing what your deal breakers are, setting boundaries, being willing to walk away if you need to. Those are all important skills for dating and relationships, period.
Totally. It's about protecting yourself, emotionally and making sure you're getting into relationships because you actually want to be there, not because you're scared of being alone or you feel like that's what you're supposed to do.
Defining success on your own terms, not by someone else's rules.
Yes, 100%. And I think that's a really powerful takeaway from all of this. The rational male, even with all the controversy, it makes us think about some big questions like, what do we actually want from our relationships? What does a successful relationship even look like to us? And what does it really mean to connect with someone on a deep level?
And maybe those questions, those are the most valuable thing we can take away from this whole deep dive. It's not about agreeing or disagreeing with every single thing Tomasi says. It's about using his ideas to, like, take a look at our own lives, have honest conversations about how complicated dating and relationships are, especially these days.
Yeah, it's about engaging with these ideas, figuring out what resonates for you, and leaving the rest behind.
So that's a wrap on our deep dive into the rational male. We'd love to hear your thoughts, though. Have you read the book? What do you think about Tomasi's ideas? Did you find any of this helpful? Let us know in the comments and let's keep the conversation going.
And hey, remember, there's always more to learn, more to figure out when it comes to, this whole human connection thing.